So some of you may already be familiar with those statistics or similar statistics that I read earlier. You may be familiar with those on a personal level, possibly because someone you know and love, like a family member or a friend, struggles with a mental illness. Perhaps you live with a mental illness, a form of mental illness yourself. We know that emotional and mental illness is especially prevalent among people of a certain age like us. We also know that it's prevalent among minorities, particularly the African American community and indigenous peoples. So all of us here, without a doubt, are familiar with this in one way or another. And I am intimately acquainted with mental illness because particularly various kinds of depression. It runs in my family, on both my mother and my father's side. And it's been passed down for generations. Both my parents, especially my mother, were chronic depressives. Neither of them ever sought treatment, although they were encouraged to do so by our family physician. And their reason for refusing treatment, mostly my mother's refusal, was that they were Christians and they didn't need to tell anyone else their problems. They didn't need a psychiatrist. They could just bring those things to Jesus and that would solve the problem. I can tell you that it didn't. My oldest sister suffers from it. She's my oldest sibling. And my oldest brother lived with multiple forms of mental illness before he passed away in 2010. My sister has never been in therapy and, like my parents, won't go. My brother was constantly in treatment, but primarily through medication. And if you ask me, over medication, if you like. I have lived with depression for as long as I can remember. While I didn't recognize it back then, looking back now, I realized that I was already in the throes of depression as far back as grade school. The factors that contributed to then and over the years are many, but nothing that I will go into here. Suffice it to say that over the years, I've struggled to come to grips with my own mental illness and have in fact been in therapy a number of times and a number of times on medication, various forms of medication. And it has not been an easy road to travel. Some of you can understand why. But many people simply don't understand just what depression or mental illness in general is, or how it affects those who live with it. And so, hence the title for today's sermon. And I deliberately used the word stupid in the title because even though I know many people are usually well-meaning when they talk to someone with depression, they say, frankly, stupid things quite often. What are some of those stupid things? Well, hey, cheer up. Things will get better. Just be grateful for what you have. You know, have an attitude of gratitude. Make a gratitude list every morning and every evening. That'll cheer you up. You should pray more. God will take care of you. Come on, it can't be that bad. Exercise more. Go for a walk. Do something for other people. Don't be self-centered. Helping others takes your mind off your problems. And my favorite, don't be so sad. You know, it reminds me of Dick Van Dyke in Bye Bye Birdie. Gray skies are gonna clear up, put on a happy face. Well-meaning, yes, but still stupid because after all, it's 2022. And unless you're living in a cave without any connection to the outside world, you know that depression is not about being sad. It's said all the time now. Everyone gets sad. Everyone gets the blues. Everyone. And yes, some people have some extended periods of sadness, but they generally find that that sadness goes away. Depression, though, and other mental illnesses have a legion of reasons that have nothing to do with sadness. And very often the reasons aren't even understood by the person suffering from it. In my own experience, my depression lives somewhere just below the surface of my conscious thought. When I was first in therapy, one of the first times I went to therapy, I was told I had what's called a baseline depression. And that's only part of it, as I found out later on. A wave of recognizable deep depression can come out of nowhere for no explicable reason. I've shared with others my experience, for example, of I'll be driving in my car on a beautiful sunny day, window down, the radio on, and I'm one of those people, one of those old hippies. If it's not rock and roll, if it's not loud, so I'm blasting the music. And I'm singing along with the music. And then boom, out of nowhere, a wave of depression overtakes me that I just can't shake. Sometimes it's a tidal wave. And on more than one occasion, it's been like a tsunami. One anonymous writer describes in the third person what depression in its extremest form feels like. They write, on his hands and knees, bent down, bowed in pain and anguish. The earth is cracked and dried as far as the eye can see. Black clouds overhead hang low. It's almost suffocating. It's dark enough, but light enough to see the surroundings. A voice in his head, or maybe outside his head, says, this is where you live. You live in depression. I am depression, and I control you. I've always controlled you. There's no escape. And I have my cohorts, fear, guilt, shame, despair, and others to help keep you there. They make you do all the things you do, like hiding your past, lying, running away from problems, procrastination. You will never change. You will die in depression. He wants to scream and rage against this, but he hasn't the strength. He hasn't the courage. It was long ago taken from him, if he ever had it at all. He wants to stand up like a warrior with a sword and battle his way out of this life of fear, to begin again, to live in truth, to never again give in to fear, but he simply can't. Understanding the difference between sadness and the blues, being down, and actual depression isn't easy. And partly because of our definitions and the words we've come to use over the years to describe it. The author, William Styron, addresses this at length in his wonderful, horrific, harrowing, but wonderful autobiographical memoir. It's called Darkness Visible, a memoir of madness, in which he recounts his own personal nightmare dealing with a severe major depressive event that almost resulted in him taking his own life. But regarding that word depression, he writes this. He says, when I was first aware that I had been laid low by the disease, I felt a need, among other things, to register a strong protest against the word depression. Depression, most people know, used to be termed melancholia, a word which appears in English in the year 1303 and crops up more than once in Chaucer, who in his usage seemed to be aware of its pathological nuances. Melancholia would still appear to be a far more apt and evocative word for the blacker forms of the disorder, but it was usurped by a noun with a blank tonality, and lacking any magisterial presence, used indifferently to describe an economic decline or a rut in the ground. a true wimp of a word for such a major illness. It may be that the scientist generally held responsible for its currency in modern times, a Johns Hopkins Medical School faculty member justly venerated, the Swiss-born psychiatrist Adolf Meyer, had a keen ear for the finer rhythms of English and therefore was unaware of the semantic damage he had inflicted for such a dreadful and raging disease. Nonetheless, for over 75 years, the word has slithered innocuously through the language like a slug, leaving little trace of its intrinsic malevolence and preventing, by its insipidity, a general awareness of the horrible intensity of the disease when out of control. He goes on to say this, he says, as one who has suffered from the malady in extremis, yet returned to tell the tale, I would lobby for a truly arresting designation. Brainstorm, for instance, has unfortunately been preempted to describe somewhat jocularly intellectual inspiration, but something along these lines is needed. Told that someone's mood disorder has evolved into a storm, a veritable howling tempest in the brain, which is indeed what a clinical depression resembles like nothing else, even the uninformed layman might display sympathy rather than the standard reaction that depression evokes, something akin to, so what? Or you'll pull out of it, or we all have bad days. The phrase nervous breakdown seems to be on its way out, certainly deservedly so, owing to its insinuation of a vague spinelessness. But we still seem destined to be saddled with depression until a better, sturdier name is created. Depression is not just being in a rut. In its severest form, it's more like paralysis. The urge to sleep is constant because sleeping, if it's possible at all, gives at least a little bit of respite from the pain. That is, if it's not accompanied by nightmares. The disinterest, even the ability to do anything, to get out of bed in the morning, to take care of one's bodily needs, like bathing or showering, getting dressed, eating, making the bed, becomes very, very difficult. It affects every aspect of one's life, and it affects everyone in that person's life. Like secondhand cigarette smoke, mental illness is bad for everyone's health. And again, William Styron writes this. I think he says it best. Depression afflicts millions directly and millions more who are relatives or friends of victims. As assertively democratic as a Norman Rockwell poster, it strikes indiscriminately at all ages, races, creeds, and classes, though women are at considerably higher risk than men. The occupational lists of its patients is too long and tedious to give here. It's enough to say that very few people escape being a potential victim of the disease, at least in its milder form. Despite depression's eclectic reach, it has been demonstrated with fair convincingness that artistic types, especially poets, are particularly vulnerable to the disorder, which in its graver clinical manifestation takes upwards of 20% of its victims by way of suicide. Just a few of these fallen artists, all modern, he says, make up a sad but scintillant roll call. Hart Crane, Vincent van Gogh, Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath, Mark Rothko, John Berryman, Jack London, Ernest Hemingway, William Inge, Anne Sexton, and the list goes on. We could add to that people that we know of, famous people we know. People like Anthony Bourdain, who I loved. A number of people in recent years. Robin Williams, the great comedian. Buddy Hackett, maybe all of you, I'm sure, are old enough to remember. So many people. He says, there is a region in the experience of pain, meaning regular pain, normal everyday pain that we all suffer at some time. There is a region in the experience of pain where the certainty of alleviation often permits superhuman endurance. We learn to live with pain in varying degrees daily or over long periods of time, and we are more often than not mercifully free of it. When we endure severe discomfort of a physical nature, our conditioning has taught us since childhood to make accommodations to the pain's demands, to accept it, whether pluckily or whimpering and complaining, according to our personal degree of stoicism, but in any case, to accept it. Except in intractable terminal pain, there is almost always some form of relief. We look forward to that alleviation, whether it be through sleep or Tylenol or hypnosis or a change of posture, or most often through the body's powers of self-healing. And we embrace this eventual respite as the natural reward we receive for having been temporarily such good sports and doughty sufferers, such optimistic cheerleaders for life at heart. In depression, he says, this faith in deliverance of ultimate restoration is absent. The pain is unrelenting, and what makes the condition intolerable is the foreknowledge that no remedy will come, not in a day, an hour, a month, or a minute. It is hopelessness even more than pain that crushes the soul. And so, on the decision-making of daily life, involves not, as in normal affairs, shifting from one annoying situation to another less annoying, or from discomfort to relative comfort, or from boredom to activity, but moving from pain to pain. One does not abandon, even briefly, one's bed of nails, but it is attached to it wherever it goes, wherever one goes. And this results in a striking experience, one which I have called, borrowing military terminology, he says, the situation of the walking wounded. For in virtually all other serious sickness, a patient who felt similar devastation would, by lying flat in a bed, possibly sedated and hooked up to the tubes and wires of life support systems, but at the very least in a posture of repose and in an isolated setting. His invalidism would be necessary, unquestioned, and honorably attained. However, the sufferer from depression has no such option and therefore finds himself like a walking casualty of war, thrust into the most intolerable social and family situations. There he must, despite the anguish, devouring his brain, present a face approximating the one that is associated with ordinary events and companionships. In other words, he has to put on a mask, right? He must try to utter small talk and be responsive to questions and knowingly nod and frown, and God help him, even smile. But it is a fierce trial attempting to speak a few simple words. Depression strikes in several forms. So when a psychiatrist makes a diagnosis of a person's depressive illness, he or she may use a number of terms, such as bipolar, clinical, major, unipolar, to describe those forms of depression. When you hear the term clinical depression, it simply means that the depression is severe enough to require treatment. When a person is badly depressed during a single severe period, he or she can be said to have an episode of major depression. And in bipolar depression, the lows alternate with the terrible highs in an often bewildering oscillation. Unipolar depression is only the downside of it all. And there's different forms of bipolar depression. There's bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and people have both. The history in the US over the last 50 odd years, since JFK's program to fund community mental health centers and to take the place of state mental hospitals, and how we have dealt with the ongoing and increasing mental health crisis in the United States does not paint a pretty picture. Certainly, we've all heard the horror stories of just what treatment, if it can be called that, in those hospitals was like since the founding of the nation. Even with advances and reforms, many of them were really nothing more than convenient places to dump the mentally ill, especially those who couldn't afford or whose families couldn't afford better facilities. Maybe you're familiar with that play, or you've seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? Nurse Ratched, how she treated the patients. That film wasn't off the mark at all. And while community mental health centers are valuable and important, and it's important to recognize the effect that mental illness has on so many aspects of life in this country and around the world. And while they have and still do help millions, they're frequently underfunded and understaffed. And frequently, they're not utilized by the community that needs them the most, particularly communities with high rates of poverty and crime. And the effort on the part of many politicians of both major parties, especially recently, to clean up our cities, and get the homeless and mentally ill off the streets is again increasing and creating a further crisis. We see that right across the river now, as New York Mayor Eric Adams is having the police and DPW raise the tent cities that the homeless have created around the various boroughs. Maybe you've seen that on the news. This is being done, he asserts, in order to make the city safer and get the people the help they need by placing them in shelters. But if you know anything at all about shelters in New York City or any major city throughout the country or anywhere throughout the country, you know that they are hardly safe places. And you also know that the majority of homeless and mentally ill people that they're trying to help would rather live in those tent cities. But if we're honest, the real reason is because the powers that be simply want to continue the process of gentrifying and building more expensive homes and office buildings, forcing those people out of sight and out of mind. I remember working in New York when Rudy Giuliani was the mayor and how he cleaned up the city. Suddenly there were no more homeless people on the street. They were shoved into shelters, or they were shoved outside the city somewhere. Which brings me to the response that our UU liberal religious tradition has given over the years and the treatment of the mentally ill and to mental health reform. When the early and mid 1800s saw the beginning of compassionate methods of caring for mentally ill people, Universalists and Unitarians from both the medical and social reform communities were very prominent in developing and promoting them. There was this deeply felt sensibility, a religious sensibility, especially in the belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, and a conviction that they had a responsibility to try to help change these people. That's what motivated them. One of the most important Unitarian reformers of the day was Dorothea Dix, and she was born in the town of Hampton, Maine. She grew up, though, in Worcester, Massachusetts, among her parents' relatives. She was the first child of three born to Joseph Dix and Mary Bigelow, who had very deep roots in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Her mother suffered from poor health, and so she wasn't really able to help her children or support her children. And her father, he was an itinerant bookseller and Methodist preacher, a circuit riding Methodist preacher. At the age of 12, she and her two brothers were sent to live with their wealthy grandmother in Boston to get away from them, because her father was also an alcoholic, and so was her mother, it seems, and he was also abusive. She began to teach in a school at the age of 14, believe it or not. She began to teach in a school for all girls in Worcester, Mass. At 14 years old, and she had developed her own curriculum for the class, in which she emphasized ethical living and the natural sciences. And then in 1821, she opened up a school in Boston, and that was patronized by well-to-do families. And then she began teaching poor and neglected children out of the barn of her grandmother's house. But because she suffered poor health, she had to give up all those teaching successes she had. She was raised a Catholic, but later she became a Congregationalist, and eventually she became a Unitarian because she began working as a governess on Beacon Hill for William Ellery Channing's family. He was, as we all know, one of our leading Unitarian ancestors and intellectual, and she established a model school for girls in Boston, and that operated until 1836, when she had a physical and nervous breakdown. So she was encouraged to take a trip to Europe to improve her health. And on her trip, she went there, by the way, with the Channings. And on her trip, she met a number of leading social reformers in Europe and in England. And she met the Rathbone family there. They invited her as a guest to Greenbank. They were a very important family. They were Quakers. They were very prominent in the Reform movement. And so they invited her as a guest to their ancestral home, their mansion, if you will, in Liverpool called Greenbank, where she met all these different people that they knew who were in the social welfare reform arena. And they would really influence her. She was introduced to the reform movement for the care of mentally ill there, and where it was known as lunacy reform. When she returned to America in 1840, 41, around there, she conducted a statewide investigation of care for the mentally ill in Massachusetts. And her interest for helping out the mentally ill started while she was teaching classes at that time for female prisoners in East Cambridge. And she saw how those women were locked up and whose medical needs weren't being satisfied, since only private hospitals would have the things they needed. And it was during the time while she was in East Cambridge in the prison with those women that she visited the basement where they used to keep the mentally ill people. They kept them apart from the general population. And she encountered 4 mentally ill individuals whose cells were, she says, dark and bare, and the air was stagnant and foul. She saw how such individuals were labeled as loony paupers and were being locked up along with violently deranged criminals, and they received treatment that was inhumane. In most cases, towns contracted with local individuals to care for the mentally ill who couldn't care for themselves. But that didn't really work too well because people would take the money and then simply lock the people up in a room in their homes. And then Dix published the results of her findings in a report called A Memorial to the state legislature in Massachusetts. She says, "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth in cages, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." And it's a very long memorial that she writes, so I'm not going to read it, but her lobbying resulted in a bill to expand the state's mental hospitals in Worcester. She did the same thing in New Jersey in 1844. In fact, Fort Dix in New Jersey is named after her great-great uncle, who was a Civil War general. And so they appropriated funds to create what came to be known as Trenton State Hospital. At the end of the Civil War, she helped raise funds for the National Monument to Deceased Soldiers at Fortress Monroe. And then she continued her work with the mentally ill, trying to improve both the prisons that they were in and also to create more hospitals for them. And eventually in 1881, she moved herself into the New Jersey State Hospital, which had been Trenton State Hospital, that she had helped build years before, because the state legislature had designated a suite for her own personal and private use as long as she lived. And she continued to carry on her work and correspondence until she died on July 17th in 1887. But she's only one example of our UU activism in the area of mental health reform. And that work continues today in many forms, particularly with the Unitarian Universalist Mental Health Network. And you can find information about them at uumentalhealth.org. But what can we do in our individual daily lives for people who we know or who we meet who may be suffering from mental illness, depression in particular, since I'm speaking about it today? Well, first, recognize the signs of depression. It may include drug abuse, because self-medication is often part of that, truancy from school and jobs, changes in eating or sleeping habits, lack of motivation, avoidance, preoccupation with death or talk of suicide. Tell them that you love them and that you care for them. Sit with them if that's all they need. Too much talk can be a hindrance as well. Make sure that they get the help that they need. For example, a therapist or a hospital stay if that's needed. You might have to help make the appointment for them, and you might have to go with them. If they're suicidal, get them immediate help. And if they're hospitalized, visit them. And help them with continuing therapy, support them in continuing therapy, support them in their efforts to find the best medicines for them. It's not an easy road when you're taking medication. Sometimes medications work, sometimes they're not effective, sometimes they're not good for you. So often doctors have to change the dosage or change the medications themselves. And it's not easy for a person having to take those medications. And especially if you here are suffering from depression or any mental illness, don't hesitate to share it with other members of our community here. That's what beloved community is. Depression and mental illness are not unmanageable or not even unconquerable. In closing, let me again read the words. This is the closing words of William Styron's book. He says, since antiquity, in the tortured lament of Job, in the choruses of Sophocles and Aeschylus, chroniclers of the human spirit have been wrestling with a vocabulary that might give proper expression to the desolation of melancholia. Through the course of literature and art, the theme of depression has run like a durable thread of woe, from Hamlet's soliloquy to the verses of Emily Dickinson and Gerard Manley Hopkins, from John Donne to Hawthorne and Dostoevsky and Poe, Camus and Conrad and Virginia Woolf. In many of Albrecht Dürer's engravings, there are harrowing depictions of his own melancholia. The manic wheeling stars of Vincent van Gogh are precursors of the artist's plunge into dementia and the extinction of self. It's a suffering that often tinges the music of Beethoven or Schumann and Mahler and permeates the darker cantatas of Bach. The vast metaphor which most faithfully represents this fathomless ordeal, however, is that of Dante, and his all too familiar lines still arrest the imagination with their augury of the unknowable, the black struggle to come, where Dante says, in the middle of the journey of life, I found myself in a dark wood, for I had lost the right path. One can be sure that these words have been more than once employed to conjure the ravages of melancholia. But their somber foreboding has often overshadowed the last lines of the best known part of that poem, with their evocation of hope. To most of those who have experienced it, the horror of depression is so overwhelming as to be quite beyond expression, hence the frustrated sense of inadequacy found in the work of even the greatest artists. But in science and art, the search will doubtless go on for a clear representation of its meaning, which sometimes, for those of us who have known it, is a simulacrum of all the evil of our world. Our everyday discord and chaos, our irrationality, warfare and crime, torture and violence, our impulse toward death and our flight from it held in the intolerable equipoise of history. If our lives had no other configuration but this, he writes, we should want and perhaps deserve to perish. If depression had no termination, then suicide would indeed be the only remedy. But one need not sound the false or inspirational note to stress the truth that depression is not the soul's annihilation. Men and women who have recovered from the disease, and they are countless, bear witness to what is probably its only saving grace. It is conquerable. For those who have dwelt in depression's dark wood and known its inexplicable agony, their return from the abyss is not unlike the ascent of the poet, meaning Dante, trudging upward and upward out of hell's black depths, and at last emerging into what he saw as the shining world. There, whoever has been restored to health has almost always been restored to the capacity for serenity and joy, and this may be indemnity enough for having endured the despair beyond despair. And then he quotes Dante. He says, and I'm going to try the Latin here, e quindi uscimo a riveter le stelle. And so we came forth and once again beheld the stars. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.